My name is Roger Potter, and I started Step Together volunteering some 30 years ago when it was initially called Youth for Britain for a variety of reasons that caused us to want to change it later on. It then became Worldwide Volunteering for Young People, and then as we realized how applicable what we were doing was to all age groups, it came to Step Together, which it now is, and that process took place over 30 years. I was lucky enough to be educated at an independent school myself, went on to Oxford University to read history, and then after I left university, I wasn't at all sure what I wanted to do, so I went off with VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas, and had a fascinating year in East Pakistan, as it then was, Bangladesh now. And that, I suppose, sowed the seed of volunteering in my thinking, which wasn't actually to come to fruition until years later. Coming back, I remember very well my father apparently had said to my mother before he collected me from the airport, whatever you do, don't ask him what he's going to do next, because he's just come back from a year and a half abroad. He won't really know what he's going to do, and it'll need some breathing space. Well, we hadn't left Heathrow Airport before he said, well, what are you going to do next? And I hadn't a clue what I was going to do next. And he said, I think this was very wise, he said, well, in that case, I will support you until Christmas. It was then mid-November, and after that, you're on your own financially, which was a wonderful sort of stimulus into doing something. And I took the first opportunity that came along with a friend offered me a job in his PR consultancy, working in London in Fleet Street. And I took that on and worked in PR for a year. Very interesting experience, learnt a dickens of a lot, but realised that it wasn't for me. And so I then thought what to do next, and by chance I was contacted by the headmaster of Stowe, which was this wonderful school in rural Buckinghamshire, wrote and said, was I interested in taking on term or 2 terms placements to replace someone who was going on a sabbatical year. And I thought, well, why? I've got nothing to lose, why not? Off I went. And I took on the job for 2 terms and was there for the next 18 years. I remember that the headmaster I was referring to, as we came to the end of my interview after the first term, he said, well, you read history at university, but this job is in teaching English. How are we going to solve the problem? And I said, well, I don't know, it's up to you. You must decide whether you want me or not. And he said, well, it's perfectly obvious you know nothing. So what I suggest you do is come down to teach at Stowe or live at Stowe for a whole term before the formal appointment takes place, and you'll read up all the literature you'll be teaching the following term, and you shall take the students at tennis, and you'll take them off to the theatre at Stratford, and just find your feet in a different independent school. And that was an amazing opportunity, and that's exactly what I did. I was there for 7 or 8 years. Then I went off on a teaching exchange to Canada, where again I was sort of teaching English, a bit of history. Came back to take over one of the boarding houses at Stowe, stayed there for 8 or 10 years before moving back to London as headmaster of an independent sixth form college. And actually this happened, I always tell people this story. I was sitting up a mountain halfway up the Himalayas in Nepal when it suddenly occurred to me that I was about to be 40. I needed to do something slightly different with my life just to keep myself fresh and challenged. And the idea of forming a charity became more and more vivid in my mind, and it all developed from there. I'd spent most of my career before Step Together working with young people, was a great believer in young people, but found at the time, we're talking about the mid to early 80s, young people got a particularly bad press for some reason and were often regarded as a problem rather than a solution. They were potentially a pool of enormous talent, with people contributing in ways that they had not done before and which they weren't being asked to do. Rather than that, it was being assumed that they were rather idle layabouts who were a menace to society rather than being a positive plus. What I realised was that people on the whole don't do things unless you ask them to do them. They need a steer, they need to be encouraged, they need to be helped, they need to be told they're wanted. All of these things apply to my thinking about young people. I began to feel not only that young people did have these qualities, but that I would like to try and do something about enabling them to release those qualities by taking on, ideally, some form of volunteering activity. Not because we thought it was good for them, although it is, we all know that it is good for people, but because we needed them, we wanted their contribution. I can't remember now how many tens of thousands of 16 to 25-year-olds there are in the country, but enough, if really brought into some scheme or other, enough to make a major contribution to life and society. The question was, how on earth do you do it? And what seemed to me was that coming from my background, it was relatively easy to get into exciting, interesting, worthwhile volunteering projects here or abroad. But for many, many people in society, that just wasn't a possibility. Why wasn't it a possibility? Because they didn't realise that the opportunity existed, because their teachers, their parents weren't encouraging them to do these things. So I spent, I suppose, the first year talking to everyone I could talk to in the volunteering world, from community service volunteers, for example, to any others, small or large, just to establish whether the sort of line I was following was going to work. And what was very interesting was that I was going to concentrate on 16 to 25-year-olds. And one of the questions I asked of anyone with whom I was researching was, can you name 10 charities that are able to take young people as volunteers? And in the whole of the research period, I never got anyone who could do that. That told me, well, golly, there is a need here and it's worth following up. The next question was financial, of course. I mean, because how was I going to survive and how were the volunteers going to survive? Well, I was lucky enough to be able to spend a bit of time voluntarily trying to set this up and didn't have to have a salary for that period of time. And I met up with a friend who agreed to be our fundraising manager, and we spent a lot of time raising money in the early days. What emerged as the first step was what we then called the Worldwide Volunteering Database, the largest collection of volunteering opportunities available in the country. And that database enabled people to search a volunteering opportunity in terms of their interests, their abilities, the time they had available, whether they could afford to put any money towards their project, whether they needed bursarial support. In other words, to make a sort of tailor-made volunteering opportunity for them. And then it would search the database, which in the end had hundreds of thousands of annual projects available all over the world. So we established what was then a very primitive form of IT, a search and match CD-ROM database, which had all the information on it, but it was interactive so that they could decide what they wanted to do. They could question the database, scrutinize it, and see whether there were opportunities. I think it was important to realize that in those days, and we were talking about the sort of early to mid-'80s, volunteering wasn't as sort of prevalent as it now. There wasn't so much concentration on volunteering. It was sort of assumed that, other people are doing that. Well, as we all know, they weren't doing it. So is there a need? How do we fund it? How do we distribute the information when we've got it? And I then thought, well, it's very important that we are registered as a charity, particularly for the fundraising, but also from the credibility point of view. So the new charity was called Youth for Britain, which I thought at the time encapsulated rather well what the sort of philosophy behind it was. Young people doing good, helping the country out, until people pointed out that it had some rather sinister connotations, of sort of teenage youth groups, etc., etc. So we then changed to Worldwide Volunteering for Young People, which was far too cumbersome a name as it turned out, but actually did accurately describe what we did. Then we began to realize, after a few years, that what we were doing was equally applicable to groups of older people, as we now know, as it was to young people. So it then became worldwide volunteering, and in the end we decided, eventually moved to our current name, Step Together Volunteering, which also has that sense of sort of community and community working together, cooperation, mutual support, and so on. So it really came from an idea in the inspiring background in Nepal to where we are today, and with 30 years under our belt. It is about that. It's definitely about giving them a second chance. It's also about giving them a first chance, which leads to them not needing a second chance. It's to say, we believe that you are a person of substantial worth. We think you've got interests and abilities that you could bring to and share with others. You don't have to. You don't have to make bad choices in life. There are other ones that you can do, but we think it's very important that you should choose them because you want to, not because we're making you do it. The whole essence of the charity is to give people a new start in life when somehow, for whatever reason, the track of their life has gone astray and they've run into difficulties, often not of their own making. I've often thought that if youngsters seem to have negative qualities, that is the fault of the generations that's brought them up or not brought them up properly. So that's the absolute essence of it. Acknowledging the abilities and potential that people have, giving them the opportunities to release that, not making it, avoiding that ludicrous paradox of compulsory volunteering, which sort of from time to time has been the sort of the noise one hears from politicians and others. And that just doesn't work. But if you go to someone and say, look, we need your help. Can you give us a hand doing this? Can you have a hand doing that? The majority of people will respond in a positive way. And that's what gives one so much pleasure. So, when I get the newsletter from STV, it's really exciting and encouraging to read the exciting things that are going on. Not particularly influenced by me, but as a result, partly of the sort of thing that I set in motion. And that is very rewarding. There's so much more that we would like to do. Infinity is a long way away. You're never going to reach it, but you will get further from the start. I think that the model that is worked on now is infinitely scalable. The only thing that's holding it back is money and personnel. And we could take this product to anywhere in the country, almost to anywhere in the world, use the same arguments, discuss it in the same sort of way, and do a similar amount of good. So, we're making a small impact on the world, and I would obviously at the time have liked it to have been a much bigger one, and we're moving in that direction. Well, I think that a seminal moment in realizing how applicable it was across the generations was my sudden awareness that whereas I'd had a rather sheltered experience before, both family and education and initially in employment, what I was doing took me to places that I'd never been before and wouldn't have done otherwise. And what I mean by that is that we found ourselves working in some very difficult areas where we came across young girls who were selling themselves on the streets from school or other, possibly not school, other backgrounds. I'd had that sort of experience, and I'd also had the experience of being invited to Buckingham Palace to explain what we were doing and take part in a ceremony there. And that range of opportunities, I think it did two things. One, it enormously enhanced my own life experience, but it also demonstrated that this was something that would work across the board. I never thought that we would be having a discussion of this sort all those years ago, but here we are, and that's excellent. I think just the fact that we've been going for 30 years makes me very proud, and I think I'm also proud of the sort of way in which everyone's managed to be flexible with the changing priorities, changing interests, changing circumstances of the charity. I think a very proud moment was when we did some work with a young offenders institution at Feltham Young Offenders Institution, where the governor of the institution said when we went to talk to him about the prospect of working in the prison with his young people, he said, well, having listened to what we were planning to do, he said, if you get one person a year to volunteer from the background they're coming from in Feltham, that will be a huge success. And I thought, well, that can't be the case. I'm sure we're going to do better than that. And needless to say, we were able to make a much better impact than he had thought was possible. And that, I think, particularly showed how worthwhile it was, that if a person in his position, who was doing so much to help young people, didn't yet see what the potential of this was, although very willing to support it, that was a major achievement, I think. And that is true of almost everyone. If you can find the flame or the spark that you can turn into a flame, then that is the reward for what you're doing.